I never slept well, but that night broke all records. My eyes were heavy, yet my mind refused calm. When I finally drifted off, the dream felt like a second reality. I was in a hotel suite, a space lavish and alien, with sunlight bouncing off polished marble floors. Daniel was there, impossibly relaxed, his laugh echoing around the room. Beside him, Ava, the assistant who smiled with too much familiarity, handed him a folder. They signed a document together, their heads leaning in close, whispering over the papers. I could see it all, the exact pen strokes, the tiny smirk Daniel flashed when Ava complimented him on a clever clause. I woke up gasping, heart hammering. My apartment was dark, the familiar weight of my insomnia pressing down, but the cold knot of certainty had settled in my stomach. Daniel was cheating. Worse, it was methodical, strategic, calculated. I'd been ignoring small inconsistencies for months. The sudden business trips, the secretive emails, the way he suddenly cared about security more than ever. I knew instinctively this wasn't just an affair. It was professional sabotage wrapped in intimacy. I sat up in bed, letting the clarity wash over me. It was almost serene in its own way. Betrayal, when dissected coldly, was a puzzle. And I was good at puzzles. My insomnia, my constant vigilance, my meticulous nature, all of it had prepared me for this. Tonight, I would start documenting, verifying, tracing. I would not react emotionally. I would act strategically. I knew where to start. Daniel's old work devices. They had been slated for wiping weeks ago, forgotten in the chaos of our last corporate move. I remembered one tablet, dusty and discarded in a drawer of my office. It was obsolete, not connected to the cloud, no longer supported. Perfect. I retrieved it quietly, careful to avoid waking Daniel. Sitting at my kitchen table, I powered it on. The startup sequence was painfully slow, a relic from another era, but I barely noticed. My fingers hovered over the login screen, calculating. Default password protocols, saved cookies, traceable patterns, all things Daniel underestimated because he assumed I trusted him implicitly. I bypassed the outdated security without breaking a sweat. The screen lit up, showing emails, documents, and calendar logs. I scanned quickly, letting my instincts guide me. There it was, a thread that made my stomach drop, but also sent a wave of vindicated adrenaline through me. Ava. Daniel. Scheming. Laughing. Coordinating. Every intimate detail from my dream was mirrored in the digital record. I leaned back, absorbing the profound clarity of the moment. The betrayal wasn't just romantic, it was intellectual, professional, financial. Daniel's charming smile had been a mask for theft. And now, finally, I had the ammunition to strike back, not recklessly but systematically, with precision. This was my rebirth. The Zoe who slept lightly, trusted easily, or turned a blind eye was gone. In her place stood a vigilant, calculating woman, ready to expose the truth, reclaim control, and, if fate permitted, find something real in the ashes of what Daniel had destroyed. I took a deep breath, letting the cold clarity sink in. This was only the beginning. The tablet hummed faintly in my hands, a cold, glowing reminder that I was holding someone else's secrets, Daniel's secrets. My heartbeat was steady, deliberate, a rhythm I forced myself to maintain. I had never been the type to act impulsively, and tonight, no matter how raw the emotions simmered, I would act with precision. Betrayal was a virus, and I was about to quarantine it. I opened the email application first, letting the subject lines roll like a forensic timeline. Ava. Her name repeated in bold, italicized text, in signatures, in forwarded messages. And Daniel's responses, smug, calculated, carefully crafted to appear mundane if anyone stumbled across them, showed an intimacy that went far beyond casual flirtation. At first, I skimmed, letting my mind absorb patterns, recognizing the cadence of their collaboration. They weren't just exchanging stolen glances or secret rendezvous times. Every message, every attachment, every casual good luck had a dual purpose: manipulation and theft. Proprietary documents, financial spreadsheets, strategic notes, all subtly rerouted, copied, and annotated to prepare the launch of their own venture. My chest tightened. This wasn't just an affair, it was corporate treason. One email stood out. The subject line read, "Liability neutralization. Step 1. I hesitated for half a second, my stomach twisting. Then I clicked. There, plain as daylight, was my name, Zoe. The message outlined, in chillingly clinical detail, how I was a potential obstacle. The liability who needs to be neutralized before series of funding, it said, a line typed with detachment that made my blood run cold. They weren't worried I would confront Daniel emotionally. They were planning the sabotage of my career, my trust, my stability. I leaned back, absorbing the weight of the digital proof in front of me. This was the moment where fear could have taken hold, where panic could have clouded clarity. But it didn't. I had spent years dealing with breaches, with secrets hidden behind layers of code and encryption. I had trained my mind to approach deception like a system error, to find the flaw and exploit it, to correct it. And I could do the same here. I systematically downloaded the emails, saving them in encrypted folders. Each attachment, each forward, each timestamp was a breadcrumb trail. I annotated quietly in my mind, marking evidence for the precise moments of betrayal, noting the duplicity that spanned both my personal and professional lives. With every file secured, I felt a measure of calm, as if by cataloging the lies I could neutralize them before they caused irreversible damage. Then came the spreadsheets. Financial flows, investment notes, projected revenue, all manipulated to give Ava and Daniel an early advantage. I traced the discrepancies with my usual analytical obsession. Each misdirected fund, each falsified memo, was a thread I could pull to unravel the whole scheme. I was no longer just a woman scorned. I was a strategist, a sentinel. My heart beat faster, not from fear, but from the thrill of finally being in control, of reclaiming the narrative that Daniel had tried to write without me. Hours passed in silence. Outside, the city slept. I barely noticed the creeping exhaustion, fueled instead by adrenaline and righteous clarity. The betrayal, once diffuse and haunting, now had a shape, a vector, a plan. And I was ready to act, not with vengeance rooted in emotion, but with precision, exposing everything with undeniable evidence. Finally, I paused. The tablet glowed in the dark, a silent partner in my awakening. I realized that to reclaim myself, and perhaps even my future love, I needed to enlist someone outside this tangled web, someone whose judgment I could trust implicitly. That someone was Ryan, the investigative journalist and my best friend's brother, whose reputation for exposing corporate corruption was spotless. If I approached him carefully, with this evidence in hand, Daniel and Ava would not just face heartbreak, they would face public reckoning. I closed the tablet, the encrypted files secure. A wave of cold satisfaction washed over me. The rebirth I had felt after the dream was now a tangible plan. Betrayal had awakened me, and for the first time in months, I felt alive, not angry, not devastated, but powerful, deliberate, and capable of orchestrating justice with both clarity and dignity. Tonight, I was no longer the woman who trusted blindly. Tonight, I was Zoe, the architect of exposure. And Daniel and Ava were about to meet their reckoning. I didn't hesitate. I knew Ryan's reputation. He had a knack for seeing through the smoke and mirrors that most people took at face value. And he was meticulous, relentless, and precise, qualities I admired deeply. I also knew he had a personal code. He wouldn't exploit a source, and he wouldn't let a story compromise someone he respected. He was my kind of ally, and for the first time since the dream, I felt a flicker of trust, a rare, fragile ember I hadn't allowed myself in months. I called him, careful with my words. I didn't tell him everything at once, only enough to pique interest and convey urgency. Within minutes, he was at my apartment, moving like a quiet storm, scanning the tablet and nodding with the intensity of someone already formulating the path forward. There was no small talk, no polite preamble. This was the language we both spoke, the language of evidence and analysis, of truth laid bare. Emails, attachments, timestamps, financial flows, Ryan murmured, almost to himself, as he scrolled through the folders. His eyes narrowed, a subtle lift of the brow marking surprise at the thoroughness of the digital trail. This is more than just an affair. They're orchestrating a corporate theft under the guise of a romantic entanglement. Incredible work, Zoe. I blinked, startled by the praise. It wasn't from Daniel. It wasn't empty flattery. It was professional respect, and it made my chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with anger or betrayal. I cleared my throat, forcing my focus back on the task. It's precise. I had to be sure. One wrong move and it could backfire on me entirely. Ryan leaned back, studying me with a measured gaze that made me uncomfortable in a way that was unusual. There was admiration there, yes, but something softer, something subtly personal. He handed the tablet back, brushing a stray lock of hair behind his ear with one hand as he spoke. You handled this perfectly. Most people would panic, make mistakes, leave traces.
Not you.
You're meticulous. Brilliant, even. I felt heat rise in my cheeks, a subtle flutter. I focused on the files again, suppressing the thought of the way his eyes lingered on me, the faint smile that tugged at the corner of his mouth.
Focus.
Evidence. Exposure. Everything else could wait. We spent hours combing through the emails, cross-referencing financial movements with project timelines and the subtle shifts in Daniel's calendar. Every discovery, every revelation, strengthened the case, and with every shared insight, I felt a quiet camaraderie forming between us. Ryan asked questions that only someone with deep ethical scrutiny would ask. I provided clarifications, details, and timelines, and our minds moved in sync, fast, efficient, a well-tuned machine operating in perfect harmony. And yet, beneath the professional intensity, I felt it, the subtle friction of connection. The way he occasionally brushed against my arm when pointing to something on the screen, the way our laughter at a particularly audacious line of Ava's felt charged with something more than amusement. It was careful, restrained, yet unmistakably there, like the faint hum of a current under still water. By the time dawn crept through the blinds, the first layer of the exposé was ready in my mind. Ryan leaned back in his chair, stretching, his fingers brushing mine briefly as he handed over a folder I hadn't noticed. The touch lingered, and for a heartbeat, I almost forgot Daniel, Ava, and the betrayal that had sparked this whole operation. Almost. Ryan's voice drew me back. We'll move carefully. This is bigger than just an affair. Legal exposure, corporate damage, you'll be protected every step of the way. And he added with a faint, teasing lift of his brow, you're going to look like a genius when this is all over. I allowed myself the briefest smirk, the first genuine one since the dream. I like being a genius, I said softly, almost to myself, but loud enough for him to hear. His grin in response was sly, knowing, and somehow intimate. The tension between us was no longer just in the files and the evidence. It was in our proximity, in the way we shared the work, the energy, and the thrill of unmasking betrayal. For the first time in a long time, I felt alive. Not just alive in the way of revenge or exposure, but alive in the way of trust, of connection, and yes, of desire. The plan was set. The execution would be clean. And somewhere along the line, I realized that I might not just be saving myself. I might be discovering something new, something far more dangerous and exhilarating, the possibility of love that was real, mutual, and fiercely intelligent. By mid-morning, the apartment felt like a war room. Maps, spreadsheets, and open emails sprawled across the dining table, and the laptop glowed with evidence we could barely contain. I sat across from Ryan, our knees nearly brushing under the table. I tried not to notice it, tried not to let the small thrill of proximity distract me, but I couldn't. His focus, the quiet intensity in his eyes as he scrolled through data, the occasional tilt of his head, it was magnetic. Look at this, I said, pointing to a timeline of Daniel's travel and the corresponding shifts in Ava's project updates. They've synced their personal meetings with the corporate calendar so precisely. It's almost elegant in a terrifyingly calculated way. Ryan leaned closer, his shoulder brushing mine. Elegant, yes. Criminally so. But it's sloppy in a different way. Digital breadcrumbs, timestamps, metadata. They didn't anticipate someone with your thoroughness. His voice had a hint of warmth, and I felt a jolt at the word. You've covered every angle. I cleared my throat, keeping my attention on the documents, though I couldn't ignore the subtle tension in the air. The warmth of him near me was distracting, a pulse under my skin I hadn't felt in a long time. I like to make sure the plan works, I murmured, careful to keep it professional. He glanced at me, an almost imperceptible smirk playing on his lips. You don't just make it work, you make it nearly impossible to fail. I have to admit, it's impressive. And a little intimidating. The words were casual, but the underlying teasing edge was unmistakable. My pulse skipped. We went over the emails, crafting the framework for exposure. Every detail mattered. Who received what, when, and how to time the release to maximize impact. Ryan suggested a multi-step approach: news outlets, corporate investigators, and legal pressure. I nodded along, occasionally glancing at him. The chemistry between us was subtle, growing, a quiet tension in every shared look and brush of hands over the keyboard. At one point, our hands brushed as we reached for the same folder of PDFs. I froze, a small spark firing in my chest. He looked at me, eyes darkening slightly, the faintest smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. Seems like we're in sync, he murmured, his voice low, just enough for me to feel it. My throat tightened, and I had to clear it to speak. We worked for hours, diving into financial documents, encrypted messages, and travelogues. Every discovery of deception, every layer of betrayal, made the need for action more urgent. And yet, as the hours passed, the professional intensity between us blurred into something more personal. His subtle glances lingered, and I caught myself leaning just a fraction closer when we shared screens. By late afternoon, I realized something dangerous. I was thinking about him not as the journalist helping me, but as Ryan, the man whose warmth and intelligence I trusted, whose teasing comments made me laugh, whose presence was suddenly necessary in ways that had nothing to do with the investigation. I was drawn to him, and I knew he felt it too, in the subtle tilt of his head, the way his hand briefly lingered near mine, the quick flash of something unspoken in his eyes. Finally, we took a break. Ryan stood, stretching, and his hand accidentally brushed mine as he moved past. The contact lingered, and I felt a pulse of electricity I couldn't ignore. He looked down at me, an almost imperceptible lift of his brow, and smiled. A smile that was both professional and something more. My pulse quickened, and I realized, with a thrill and a hint of fear, that our partnership was shifting. This is going to be messy, I said, voice quiet. Ryan leaned just slightly closer, his shoulder almost touching mine, and said softly, "Messy is our specialty. And we work well together." There was an edge to his tone, subtle but loaded, and I caught the tiniest glint of flirtation in his eyes. My breath hitched, but I forced myself to nod, focusing on the strategy in front of us rather than the heat between us. Still, as I glanced at him, I realized that this mission, this exposure, wasn't just about justice anymore. It was also about discovering something I hadn't expected, someone I could trust, who made me feel alive, and who might just be dangerous enough to steal my heart. The night was unusually quiet for the city, the hum of traffic below my apartment a muted backdrop as Ryan and I sat shoulder to shoulder, plotting the first move. The evidence we had gathered was damning, meticulous, and enough to bring Daniel and Ava to their knees. But even with everything in order, a whisper of nerves ran under my skin. It wasn't fear of failing. My plan was flawless, but the adrenaline buzzed through me, a current that Ryan seemed to feel too. I leaned over the laptop, checking the sequence of emails we would release first. Ryan's hand brushed mine again as he shifted a folder, and I felt the subtle spark that had been building over the last few days. My pulse quickened, though I tried to focus on the task. He noticed. I could tell by the slight tilt of his head and the teasing lift of his brow. "You're tense," he murmured, voice low enough that it sent a thrill down my spine. "Excited or nervous?" I tried to shrug it off, keeping my eyes on the screen. Professional anticipation, I said, though the heat rising to my cheeks betrayed me. He leaned closer, close enough that the scent of him, coffee and a hint of mint, filled my senses. The proximity made it impossible not to notice how much I wanted this collaboration, and maybe more than just professional. Professional, huh, he whispered, his breath brushing my ear. I think it's both. I swallowed hard, focusing on the evidence and not the magnetic pull of him beside me. There were emails to sort, metadata to annotate, and carefully timed messages to the journalist network to send. Every detail mattered. Daniel and Ava were precise, cunning, and arrogant enough to believe they were untouchable. But Ryan and I had something they didn't: meticulous planning and a shared moral edge. Hours passed in a blur of clicks, typing, and occasional glances that lingered too long. At one point, our hands touched deliberately as we reached for the same file. I froze, a jolt of heat traveling through me. Ryan's gaze met mine, darkened and intent, and the smallest, almost imperceptible smirk tugged at his lips. The air between us was taut with unspoken tension, professional focus colliding with something more dangerous. We're about to go live with the first batch, he said, voice steady but low, intimate in a way that made my chest tighten. His fingers brushed mine again as he handed me a flash drive. The contact lingered just long enough to make me acutely aware of every nerve ending, and I almost lost focus, but I couldn't. Not entirely. I took a deep breath and pressed enter on the first set of emails. Instantly, the system transmitted our evidence to the selected network of journalists. Ryan's hand found mine again, a brief, electric touch that lingered, almost claiming me in a way that made me shiver. I didn't pull away. I couldn't. The moment passed too quickly, and we returned to the screens, but the energy between us had shifted. He leaned in close, his shoulder brushing mine, and whispered, "We make a good team." His lips were close enough that I could feel his breath, warm and steady, and my pulse betrayed me. Better than I expected. I let out a quiet laugh, the tension of the evening melting into something charged, dangerous, and thrilling. "I'll hold you to that," I murmured, teasing, and caught his half-smile. We continued working, the night stretching ahead of us, each moment bringing the thrill of the investigation and the subtle pull between us. Every click, every confirmation of data sent, was punctuated by a shared glance or the brush of our hands. It was professional, but it wasn't entirely. Something deeper was stirring, a mutual understanding that this partnership was becoming personal, and that danger and desire were entwining in a way I had never expected. By the end of the night, the first strike had been executed flawlessly. Daniel and Ava were blindsided, and I felt a rush of satisfaction, mingled with something dangerously thrilling when Ryan leaned close again, just for a moment, brushing his lips lightly against my temple, a fleeting, hungry kiss that left me breathless. My heart raced, my mind clear. Justice was in motion, and maybe, just maybe, so was something more. The first strike was just the beginning, and the pull between Ryan and me was only intensifying. The morning sunlight was harsh, spilling across the coffee-stained table where Ryan and I had camped out, laptops humming, evidence spread like a battlefield before us. The first wave of emails had hit Daniel and Ava hard. Their reactions were predictably panicked, frantic calls, rush meetings, and a flurry of attempts to contain the breach. I watched the clock, calculating the optimal timing for the second phase, one that would leave no room for denial or repair. Ryan leaned back in his chair, stretching, and the corner of his mouth quirked in a way that made my chest tighten. "You're quiet," he observed, his voice casual, but the undertone carried the curiosity and subtle amusement that had me fidgeting with my pen. "Plotting our next move, or distracted?" I looked up, meeting his gaze, and for a moment the world outside the room ceased to exist. The adrenaline of the investigation had been intoxicating, but the magnetic pull between us was something different, raw, unspoken, and just as consuming. "A little of both," I admitted, trying to keep my voice steady. But my fingers brushed his as I reached for the external drive, and the spark that ran through me was impossible to ignore. He caught the contact, lingering for a heartbeat too long, his dark eyes locked onto mine. "Good," he said softly. "I like a partner who thinks ahead and pays attention to the details." The compliment sent a rush of heat through me, and I realized I was smiling, an unguarded, genuine smile I hadn't allowed myself in months. We dove into the next layer of the evidence. This phase required subtlety and precision, timed release of the contracts, internal communications, and financial records that Daniel and Ava had believed were securely hidden. Every keystroke felt deliberate, a quiet rhythm that matched the growing heartbeat between us. At one point, Ryan leaned over my shoulder to adjust a file path, and the closeness of his body pressed against mine sent an involuntary shiver down my spine. "Are you trying to distract me?" I asked, half laughing, though the tremor in my voice betrayed the tension. "Maybe a little," he admitted, eyes twinkling. "But only because it's hard to resist someone who's this good at what they do." His hand brushed mine again, deliberate this time, fingers threading lightly with mine. My breath hitched, and for a moment, I wondered if we would be able to finish the work before something else, something more urgent, drew us into its gravity. The hours blurred, and by mid-afternoon, we had orchestrated the digital release. The files went to trusted journalists and industry watchdogs, leaving Daniel and Ava scrambling, trying to contain the storm they had sown. I felt a surge of vindication, but it was tempered by the awareness that I hadn't yet allowed myself to fully acknowledge the pull I felt toward Ryan. Every glance, every brush of his hand, every shared laugh carried an intensity that went beyond the professional. When the last file was sent, we leaned back simultaneously, exhaling in unison. The room felt charged, electric, our proximity almost unbearable. Ryan's hand brushed my arm, light but deliberate, and I didn't pull away. His gaze dropped to my lips for a fraction of a second, and my pulse skyrocketed. "Celebrate?" he asked, voice low and teasing, the kind of tone that made my stomach twist in anticipation. I nodded, feeling bold, reckless, and alive. We stood, moving closer, and for a suspended moment, the tension broke. His hands cupped my face gently, and our lips met in a kiss that was slow, questioning at first, then deepening, a hungry, possessive kiss that spoke of admiration, trust, and the years of unspoken longing finally finding release. My knees weakened, and I clung to him, the outside world dissolving as if it had never existed. When we finally parted, breathless and laughing softly, I realized that this wasn't just about exposing Daniel and Ava anymore. This was about reclaiming a part of myself I had long denied, the part that wanted passion, trust, and partnership in both work and life. Ryan's smile mirrored my own, a mix of mischief and affection, and I knew we had crossed a threshold. The second phase had succeeded, and in its wake, something far more exhilarating had begun. A shared connection, unplanned and undeniable, promising both justice and the first spark of something lasting between us. As I packed up the remaining files, Ryan's hand brushed mine again, a quiet promise that our collaboration, and perhaps our hearts, were aligned. The storm was far from over, but for the first time in weeks, I felt fully awake, fully alive, and fully seen. The morning air in the city felt unusually sharp, as if even the sky had taken notice of the storm we'd unleashed. I arrived at Ryan's apartment early, drawn by the need to check on the status of the exposé and, admittedly, to see him. My heartbeat was still elevated from the kiss the day before, a lingering warmth that made even the mundane act of unlocking the door feel charged. Ryan greeted me with a grin, leaning against the doorway in a casual stance that somehow made him both commanding and effortless. "You're early," he teased, his eyes dark and knowing. Or is that just code for, "I want to see you before I check the fallout"? I smiled, the curve of his lips enough to make me forget the chaos waiting outside. "A bit of both," I admitted, my voice low, almost conspiratorial. The memory of our kiss still burned between us, and I couldn't help but notice how close he was, how easy it was to let the moment stretch. We moved into the living room, laptops open, tracking the ripple effect. News outlets had picked up the story overnight. The exposé was spreading like wildfire. Daniel's investors were in full panic mode. Funding calls were being postponed or canceled entirely, and Ava's reputation had crumbled faster than I could have predicted. I felt a vindictive satisfaction. Yes, but it was tinged with relief. I had taken control, and the consequences were undeniable. Ryan hovered over the side of the couch, close enough that our shoulders brushed repeatedly. Each contact sent sparks through me, but there was a comfort in the familiarity, a grounding presence that made me feel like I could breathe again after weeks of suffocating uncertainty. "You did this," he said, his voice soft but firm. "All of it. You didn't just uncover the truth, you orchestrated justice." I blinked, suddenly aware of the weight of his words. The gravity of our actions wasn't lost on me, and yet, the way he said them, as if he'd always known I was capable, made my chest tighten in a different way, a mix of pride and something far more personal. "I had help," I said, the tiniest smile tugging at my lips. "And I couldn't have done it without you." Ryan's grin deepened, playful and dangerous. "I like it when we work together," he said, his hand brushing mine again, this time lingering. The contact was deliberate, teasing, a subtle dance of flirtation we both understood. I felt my pulse spike. "It's energizing," I admitted, letting the words hang between us like a fragile promise. We spent the next hour monitoring social media reactions, court filings, and Daniel's frantic attempts at damage control. Every time I glanced at Ryan, I caught him stealing small looks at me, an unspoken acknowledgement of our shared victory and the tension that now existed just beneath the surface. I found myself leaning closer, seeking proximity, finding excuses to let our hands brush. Eventually, the world outside faded, and it was just us, the quiet hum of laptops, the occasional burst of laughter when Daniel made another mistake, and the magnetic pull we couldn't deny. Ryan's hand found mine once more, fingers interlacing naturally, and I held it, savoring the electricity. "Zoe," he murmured, voice low, intimate, "I can't keep pretending we're just celebrating your brilliance here. I want more." His gaze was intent, searching, and my heart thudded in agreement. I leaned toward him, closing the space, and our lips met in a kiss that was slow, deep, and affirming. It was a kiss that acknowledged the danger we'd navigated, the trust we'd built, and the desire that had been simmering beneath the surface. When we finally parted, breathless and smiling, I realized something. The chaos had cleared the space for something real. Something that wasn't manipulated, hidden, or stolen. We settled back against the couch, fingers entwined, a quiet comfort in the aftermath of the storm. The exposé would continue to wreak havoc for Daniel and Ava, but for me, the most important fallout was here in the room, the start of something genuine, electrifying, and entirely ours. And for the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to believe that I wasn't just surviving the betrayal. I was thriving. And maybe, just maybe, love could follow. The city seemed quieter now, almost cooperative, as if it understood the storm had passed. I walked into Ryan's apartment that evening, carrying a stack of freshly printed documents, copies of the exposé and evidence, just in case the lawyers needed them. But the tension that had haunted me for weeks had shifted. Daniel and Ava were facing lawsuits, media scrutiny, and financial ruin. Their empire of deceit was crumbling, and for the first time, I could exhale without guilt or anxiety. Ryan was sitting on the couch, reviewing a draft of a follow-up piece, and looked up when I entered. His eyes softened immediately, and a small, teasing smile tugged at his lips. "Back so soon?" he asked, setting the papers aside. "I wanted to make sure everything is in order," I said, sliding next to him. The couch was warm, and I felt the magnetic pull between us. I realized I didn't just want to be near him. I needed it. He leaned slightly toward me, brushing a stray strand of hair from my face. The contact was light, intimate, deliberate. My pulse quickened. "You've done more than just order the chaos," he murmured. "You've done it brilliantly, ethically, and fearlessly." I smiled faintly, the weight of exhaustion still present but softened by his gaze. "It doesn't feel fearless," I admitted. "It felt necessary." Ryan's hand found mine, fingers curling around mine naturally, confidently. I didn't pull away. Instead, I leaned a little closer, drawn to the warmth and steady presence he offered. The closeness, the small contact, ignited something dormant, a mix of relief, admiration, and desire. "I've wanted this moment for a long time," Ryan confessed softly. "Not just the victory, but us." His thumb brushed across the back of my hand, and I felt my entire body respond. I let out a small, shaky breath and leaned toward him, closing the gap. Our lips met in a kiss that was both gentle and insistent, a mixture of celebration and yearning. It wasn't hurried, but it was deep, claiming the space that had been empty for too long. My hands instinctively rested against his chest, feeling the reassuring thrum of his heartbeat. When we finally parted, just slightly, our foreheads rested together, and I could hear his breath mingle with mine. "This feels right," I whispered, and he chuckled softly, pressing his lips to my temple in a tender, lingering touch. We settled back on the couch, my head resting lightly against his shoulder. Outside, the city continued its pulse, but inside, there was stillness. I let myself relax in a way I hadn't allowed for months, letting Ryan's presence anchor me. Every brush of his hand against mine, every subtle touch, reinforced that this was no fleeting comfort. This was real. Later, as we reviewed the final details of the exposé's aftermath, I caught his eyes meeting mine. The silent understanding between us was electric. We didn't need words to acknowledge the depth of what had been shared. The fear, the betrayal, the triumph, and now, the possibility of love that wasn't complicated by deceit. "I think we make a good team," I said softly, tilting my head up to meet his gaze. "The best," he replied, leaning closer. And this time, the kiss was hungry, a promise of more than just protection or gratitude. It was intimacy, desire, and the acknowledgement of a bond forged in fire and honesty. I responded eagerly, wrapping my arms around him as if to seal the moment, the trust, and the future we were choosing together. By the time we pulled apart, the room was quiet except for our steady breathing. I rested my hand on his chest, feeling the warmth beneath my palm, and smiled. "I think this is how it's supposed to feel," I said. Ryan pressed his forehead against mine, his voice low, intimate.
Exactly.
No games. No lies. Just us. And in that moment, I knew it was true. The betrayal had burned away the illusions, leaving space for clarity, justice, and a love that was deliberate, ethical, and fiercely real. With Ryan, I wasn't just surviving, I was thriving.
Reborn. Whole.